A 70-year-old self-made multimillionaire bleeds out from a point-blank shotgun blast in his own bed, deep inside a highly secured Austin mansion. Down the hall, his young wife sleeps completely undisturbed. The alarm system is bypassed. Nothing is stolen, but the true horror isn't the break-in, it's how the trigger was pulled. The shooter is a fragile psychiatric patient, manipulated into committing murder by the woman resting quietly in the next room, a mastermind who scouted her executioner inside a mental health ward. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Stephen Beard was a man who understood the value of patience and compounding effort. By his late 60s, he had built a formidable empire in Texas, broadcasting and real estate, transforming modest local investments into a net worth well over $10 million. He was a fixture in Austin's elite circles, respectable, quiet, and deeply grounded. For decades, he shared this prosperous life with his wife, Elise. Their marriage was the bedrock of his stability. But when she succumbed to terminal cancer, his world fractured entirely. The sprawling custom-built mansion sitting on a pristine multi-acre lot suddenly felt cavernous. Wealth could buy exclusive country club memberships, but it couldn't shield him from the crushing isolation of widowerhood. He was 70 years old, mourning, and desperately lonely, a vulnerable man wrapped in a veneer of high society invincibility. Across town, the daily reality was entirely different for a woman 37 years his junior. Celeste had spent her adult life running from one financial crisis to the next. Her background was a chaotic blur of failed relationships, impulsive decisions, and chronic instability. By her early 30s, she had already been married and divorced multiple times, accumulating a trail of broken promises and drained bank accounts. She was a single mother raising twin daughters, constantly oscillating between grueling minimum wage jobs and relying on the fleeting generosity of the men she dated. She lived in cramped apartments, struggled to pay basic utilities, and fiercely resented every second of it. Celeste possessed a highly refined survival instinct. She was sharply observant, quick to identify the emotional deficits in others, and adept at molding her personality to fill those exact voids. To the outside world, she projected the image of an exhausted mother just trying to keep her head above water. But beneath that facade lay a deep-seated entitlement and a ravenous appetite for a lifestyle she felt she inherently deserved. She viewed wealth not as a milestone achieved through decades of work, but as a prize to be captured, an escape hatch from the mediocrity she despised. Her strategy shifted when she secured a job as a waitress at the exclusive Austin Country Club. This was a velvet-roped sanctuary where the city's old money gathered to drink expensive scotch and play 18 holes under the punishing Texas sun. It was an environment dripping with the affluence she craved. For Celeste, carrying trays through the dining room wasn't just a way to earn tips. It was a strategic observation post. She studied the patrons, noting the heavy gold watches, the casual conversations about offshore portfolios, and the subtle dynamics of vulnerability. The contrast between the two could not have been more absolute. Stephen was a man looking backward, grieving a quiet life that was already over. Celeste was looking forward, aggressively searching for a shortcut to the top tier of society. He wanted a warm presence to fill the deafening silence left by his late wife. She wanted an endless line of credit. The country club served as the perfect ecosystem for this predatory alignment. Stephen visited almost daily, a creature of habit. He sat at the same tables, ordered the same meals, and existed in a quiet cloud of mourning. He was highly visible, predictably routine, and completely oblivious to the fact that his open grief made him the most lucrative mark in the room. All it would take was the right smile, the right tone of voice, and someone willing to pour his coffee exactly the way he liked it. The dynamic between the grieving widower and the observant waitress shifted imperceptibly at first. The Austin Country Club was a velvet-roped sanctuary where the city's old money gathered. It was an environment defined by the clink of heavy crystal, the scent of imported cigars, and the hushed, ambient hum of generational privilege. Stephen sought a sympathetic ear in this familiar space, someone to anchor him in his sprawling, empty reality. Celeste provided exactly that. She memorized his preferences, anticipated his moods, and offered a soft, unwavering attentiveness that felt like a lifeline to a man drowning in absolute solitude. She absorbed his stories about his late wife without visible jealousy, playing the role of a comforting companion flawlessly. The transition from polite country club banter to private, candlelit dinners was swift. To the aging millionaire, she was a breath of vitality, a second chance at a vibrant life. To the struggling mother of two, he was the ultimate, long-awaited prize. When they married, the power structure of the relationship was immediately and violently rewritten. Celeste packed up her twin daughters and moved out of a cramped, poorly ventilated apartment into Stephen's sprawling 10,000-square-foot estate in an exclusive gated community. The transition was absolute. The exhausted single mother vanished, replaced overnight by a formidable socialite with unlimited access to one of the deepest bank accounts in Texas. The financial hemorrhage began almost immediately. The new bride did not just spend money, she waged war with it. She dropped tens of thousands of dollars in single afternoons at high-end boutiques, purchasing racks of designer clothing, luxury vehicles, and heavy, ostentatious jewelry. Her spending was a frantic, insatiable compulsion, a desperate attempt to fill a void that no amount of platinum could cover. She hired a massive staff to manage the estate, systematically isolating her aging husband from the daily mechanics of his own home. The quiet, dignified existence Stephen had maintained for decades dissolved into a chaotic circus of deliveries, decorators, and endless, loud social events. When Stephen attempted to impose financial boundaries, the psychological manipulation escalated into a terrifying domestic Cold War. The new wife possessed a dark mastery of emotional extortion. If he questioned credit card bills that rivaled the operating budget of a small corporation, she responded with explosive volatility. She manufactured relentless crises, threatened self-harm, and weaponized her own daughter's well-being to force his immediate compliance. The retired executive, who had ruthlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar corporate mergers throughout his career, found himself completely paralyzed. He was trapped by a woman who knew exactly how to exploit his deepest fear of abandonment. He was growing older, his health was steadily declining, and the energy required to fight the daily barrage of hysteria was simply gone. By the late 90s, the marriage had deteriorated into a gilded hostage situation. Stephen was fundamentally exhausted. To mitigate the relentless domestic warfare, he agreed to admit his wife into an upscale psychiatric facility for severe depression. It was supposed to be a temporary reprieve, a professional medical intervention to stabilize her erratic, destructive behavior. Instead, it became the perfect hunting ground. A psychiatric ward is inherently a space filled with fractured people. It is a delicate ecosystem of exposed nerves, heavy medication, and profound vulnerability. While doctors attempted to evaluate Celeste, she was busy evaluating the other patients. She bypassed the medical staff and zeroed in on the most fragile individual on the floor. Tracy Tarleton was a bookstore manager with a gentle demeanor, a deep well of raw empathy, and a paralyzing battle with clinical depression and substance abuse. She was an open wound, desperate for validation, love, and any semblance of a stabilizing anchor. When the wealthy, charismatic, and seemingly tragic millionaire's wife directed her full, predatory attention toward Tracy, the effect was hypnotic. Celeste initiated a rapid, intense emotional enmeshment. She bypassed the younger woman's defenses by mirroring her trauma, presenting herself not as an entitled socialite, but as a fellow victim of cruel circumstance. The two women formed a clandestine romantic relationship inside the sterile, heavily monitored walls of the facility. For the fragile bookstore manager, it was a profound, life-altering romance. For the mastermind, it was the careful cultivation of a deadly asset. Once discharged, the psychological conditioning intensified dramatically. The millionaire's wife ensured Tracy remained financially and emotionally tethered to her. She bought her extravagant gifts, funded her living expenses, and dictated her daily schedule. But the gifts came with a heavy, steady drip of psychological poison. Celeste began weaving a dark, entirely fabricated narrative about her marriage. She convinced her new lover that the kindly, aging Stephen was actually a controlling, physically abusive monster who was slowly destroying her will to live. Tracy absorbed every lie without question. Her grasp on reality, already severely weakened by her mental health struggles, was entirely hijacked. The manipulation was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Celeste painted a picture of a desperate, inescapable situation. She claimed she wanted nothing more than to leave her husband to be with Tracy forever. But if she tried, the powerful millionaire would strip her of her daughters and leave her utterly destitute. Or worse, he would hire someone to end her life. She cultivated a sense of absolute, suffocating urgency through late-night, tear-filled phone calls and staged panic attacks. The trap was flawlessly set. The mastermind did not need to purchase a weapon, study blueprints, or learn how to bypass a sophisticated home security system. She just needed to convince a profoundly sick, desperately in love woman that the only way to save her soulmate was to eliminate the man sleeping in the master bedroom. Tracy Tarleton, entirely stripped of her own agency and drowning in a fabricated reality, came to believe that pulling a trigger was an act of righteous, unavoidable love. The weapon was fully loaded, aimed, and merely waiting for the command to fire. The early morning hours of October 2nd, 1999, blanketed the affluent Terrytown neighborhood in a thick, oppressive autumn humidity. The sprawling 10,000 square foot estate sat quiet and imposing behind its manicured hedges. It was a fortress of new money and high-end security, designed specifically to repel unwanted elements of the outside world. But physical defenses are entirely useless when the threat is invited inside. A perimeter is only as secure as the person holding the access codes. Miles away, a pickup truck cut through the deserted Austin streets. Behind the wheel sat Tracy Tarleton. She was a bookstore manager with no criminal record, a fragile psyche, and a desperate, manufactured belief that she was on a righteous rescue mission. On the passenger seat beside her lay a heavy 20-gauge shotgun. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles blanched. She was not a cold-blooded assassin. She was a deeply ill woman, completely consumed by the psychological reality her lover had meticulously constructed for her over months of manipulation. Tracy parked a discreet distance from the estate. She stepped out into the Texas heat, the weight of the shotgun an alien sensation in her arms. The instructions echoed endlessly in her mind. Celeste had provided everything: the exact layout of the mansion, the location of the master suite, and most importantly, an unobstructed path. She approached the property line. The sophisticated alarm system, which should have immediately triggered a massive law enforcement response, remained completely silent. The perimeter had been bypassed. Tracy slipped quietly through a side door that had been intentionally left unlocked. The interior of the massive house was pitch black, the profound silence broken only by the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning unit. She moved carefully across the thick, imported carpets. She bypassed the sprawling guest suites. She walked right past the room where the millionaire's wife was supposedly sleeping. Her target was at the end of the hall. She reached the master suite. Stephen was asleep in his custom bed. He was a 70-year-old man wrapped in the false security of his own home. He wore heavy foam earplugs and a dark sleep mask, rendering him completely deaf and blind to the lethal threat, standing motionless in his doorway. Tracy raised the heavy barrel of the 20-gauge shotgun. Her hands trembled violently, fueled by a toxic, overwhelming cocktail of untreated mental illness and raw, manufactured adrenaline. She aimed through the darkness, locking onto the center of mass beneath the heavy luxury blankets. She pulled the trigger. The explosion shattered the absolute silence of the estate. The concussive blast hit Stephen directly in the abdomen at point-blank range, tearing through tissue, shattering bone. The immediate, suffocating stench of sulfur, burnt fabric, and copper filling the enclosed space. Tracy did not check for a pulse. She did not stay to observe the carnage. The deafening echo of the gunshot broke her hypnotic trance just enough to trigger a raw, primal fight-or-flight response. She turned and sprinted blindly back through the dark hallways, out the same unlocked door, and vanished into the heavy night air. But the retired executive did not die on impact. Stephen woke to an agony he could not possibly comprehend. Disoriented, his ears ringing with high-pitched feedback from the blast, he was trapped in a sensory nightmare. He reached down to his stomach and felt the warm, rapid spread of his own blood pooling rapidly across the mattress. Panic seized him. Blinded by his sleep mask, he didn't know if the house was under siege or if he was suffering a catastrophic medical event. Using sheer primal willpower, the severely wounded man dragged his bleeding body across the ruined bed. Every fractional movement forced more blood from the gaping wound. He fought through the blinding pain, his trembling fingers blindly searching the nightstand until they finally grasped the telephone. At 3:17 a.m., the emergency dispatcher received a frantic, deeply confused transmission. Stephen told the operator that he needed an ambulance immediately. Gasping for shallow breaths, he stated that his intestines were spilling out of his stomach. He was entirely unaware he had been shot. He speculated through the haze of shock that his own body had somehow inexplicably exploded from the inside. As the dispatcher worked frantically to keep the fading man on the line, the first response units were scrambled across the city. Down the hall, the catastrophic noise had finally produced a reaction. Celeste emerged from her separate bedroom. She walked into the master suite and was confronted with the gruesome, visceral reality of her own requested hit. Her reaction was an immediate, highly calculated performance. She did not rush forward to apply pressure to the massive wound. She did not attempt to hold her agonizingly injured husband or offer comfort. Instead, she fell into a state of theatrical hysterics. She screamed, she paced wildly. She played the part of a fragile, deeply traumatized wife, stumbling onto an unimaginable nightmare, keeping a careful distance from the pooling blood. When the first Austin police cruisers and paramedic units arrived, tires screeching onto the manicured driveway, they found a scene of absolute chaos. First responders rushed through the front doors with weapons drawn, clearing the massive square footage room by room. They located the master bedroom and immediately pushed past the wailing wife to reach the victim. The medical team found a catastrophic abdominal injury. They worked frantically on the floor, attempting to stabilize his rapidly crashing blood pressure. They packed the massive wound with gauze, fighting desperately to stop the terminal hemorrhage. While the paramedics fought to keep Stephen tethered to the living, the officers attempted to interview the wife. Celeste paced the grand hallway in her sleepwear. She wailed loudly, clinging to the expensive wallpaper, collapsing dramatically into the arms of the responding patrolmen. She told them she had been dead asleep in another wing of the house and was awakened only by a terrifyingly loud noise and her husband's subsequent screams of pain. She offered no helpful physical descriptions, no mention of enemies. She simply sobbed, hyperventilated, and demanded to know what kind of monster could have done something so evil to her beloved provider. But as the crime scene unit began their preliminary sweep of the perimeter, experienced detectives immediately noticed glaring anomalies. These details directly contradicted the narrative of a standard home invasion. There were no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. The multi-$1,000 security system had not been tripped, breached, or damaged. Highly expensive jewelry, cutting-edge electronics, and loose cash sitting in plain sight had been completely ignored. The trajectory of the shotgun blast indicated the assailant had stood right at the edge of the mattress. This was not a panicked burglar, firing wildly in the dark upon being discovered. This was a targeted, intimate execution. The shooter knew exactly where to go, how to bypass the alarms, and who to hit. Paramedics violently hoisted Stephen onto a stretcher. He was fading fast, his skin pale and clammy, as his organs began shutting down from severe hemorrhagic shock. They rushed him through the grand foyer, out into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting ambulance, and sped toward the trauma center. Celeste was left behind in the mansion with the detectives. As the wailing sirens of the ambulance faded into the distance, her hysterical sobbing began to subtly subside. The immediate, messy crisis was over. The performance had been delivered flawlessly. Now, she simply had to wait for the surgical team to fail, for the hospital to call, and to confirm that her status had officially transitioned from disgruntled wife to vastly wealthy widow. The surgical theater at Brackenridge Hospital was a chaotic blur of arterial blood and frantic commands. The blast had decimated the right side of the millionaire's abdomen, tearing through his intestines and shredding vital tissue. For hours, trauma surgeons worked to piece together the anatomical wreckage. They removed significant portions of his digestive tract, bypassed the ruined sections, and secured his fragmented body with rows of heavy surgical staples. When they finally wheeled him into the intensive care unit, he was heavily intubated, tethered to a wall of monitors and hovering on the absolute precipice of death. But the aging executive possessed a stubborn, gritty resilience. He did not die that morning. Instead, he entered a grueling, undignified purgatory. The next 4 months were defined by agonizing medical procedures, recurring infections, and the humiliating reality of a colostomy bag. For a man who had built an empire through control and quiet dignity, being reduced to a bedbound patient unable to feed himself was a profound psychological torment. Yet, he fought. He endured the relentless physical therapy, the excruciating dressing changes, and the heavy, disorienting waves of narcotics, driven by a singular desire to return to his sprawling estate. While Stephen battled for every shallow breath, his wife's behavior shifted from theatrical hysteria to a chilling, vacant detachment. The Austin police had immediately secured the mansion, processing the blood-soaked mattress and searching the perimeter for physical evidence. With her home temporarily designated as an active crime scene, the supposedly traumatized wife checked into an upscale, luxurious hotel. She did not pace the hospital waiting room. She did not hold vigil by her husband's bedside. Instead, she went shopping. The very next day, while surgeons monitored Stephen for secondary hemorrhaging, his wife was spotted browsing high-end boutiques. She purchased expensive designer clothing, dined at premium restaurants, and mingled with her usual country club associates. To the tight-knit, affluent Austin community, her behavior was immediately jarring. The local socialites whispered over their martinis and restricted access country club lunches. A man was clinging to life after a brutal assassination attempt in his own bed, and his bride was acting as though she were on an extended, leisurely vacation. The social echo of her absolute callousness rippled through the city's elite circles, transforming the community's initial sympathy into cold, quiet suspicion. Her hospital visits were brief, deeply inappropriate, and entirely transactional. Medical staff, nurses who observed the intimate, raw dynamics of grieving families every single day, were quietly appalled. When she did arrive at the intensive care unit, she brought the scent of heavy, expensive perfume and the loud rustle of designer shopping bags into the sterile environment. She actively avoided looking at the surgical drains or holding his bruised hands. Instead, she brought a briefcase full of financial documents. Hovering over a man heavily dosed on morphine, she relentlessly pushed him to sign checks, authorize wire transfers, and maintain her unlimited access to his banking portfolios. She complained loudly to the nursing staff about the inconvenience of the hospital parking garage and the poor quality of the cafeteria food. Her focus was entirely on the preservation of her cash flow, never on the preservation of his fading life. Even through the dense fog of painkillers, the millionaire began to sense the profound void in the woman standing over him. The romantic illusion he had purchased was cracking under the harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma ward. He grew increasingly agitated in her presence. At one point, he quietly instructed the nursing staff to limit her access, explicitly preferring the sterile, predictable company of medical machines over the hovering vulture his wife had become. Outside the hospital walls, the mastermind was facing an unexpected, critical complication. Her weapon had been captured. Investigators processing the bedroom had found a single, spent 20-gauge shotgun shell near the nightstand, a massive error by the panicked shooter. A rapid trace of local firearm purchases led them straight to Tracy Tarleton. The fragile psychiatric patient was arrested just 6 days after the shooting. She was locked in a sterile, Concrete County jail cell, facing decades behind bars. But the psychological conditioning held firm. Tracy sat in a cold cell and absolutely refused to implicate the woman she loved. She absorbed the full weight of the attempted murder charges, silently waiting for her soulmate to bail her out, to hire an expensive defense attorney, to somehow rescue her just as they had promised each other. She waited in absolute, loyal silence. Celeste, however, immediately severed all contact. She abandoned her pawn to the justice system without a second thought. Tracy was no longer a useful tool. She was a severe liability. The mastermind simply turned her back on the woman she had manipulated and waited for the final phase of her plan to materialize. In late January 2000, the brutal physical toll finally eclipsed Stephen's willpower. The catastrophic trauma to his digestive system led to a severe, cascading infection. His weakened heart could no longer sustain the battle against the creeping sepsis. 4 months after the shotgun blast shattered his quiet life, the self-made millionaire died in a hospital bed. With his final breath, the temporary freeze on the estate dissolved. The widow was now the sole inheritor of a massive, multi-million-dollar fortune. Her reaction to his passing was completely devoid of even the manufactured tears she had displayed on the night of the shooting. There was no private mourning period. There was no quiet reflection. In the weeks following the burial, her spending escalated into pure, unhinged gluttony. She bought a fleet of luxury vehicles. She threw lavish, loud parties at the estate, the music echoing through the exact same halls where her husband had bled on the carpet. She treated her newfound status not as a tragedy, but as a hard-won victory. The illusion of the grieving wife was entirely discarded. She had the money, the mansion, and the absolute freedom she had craved her entire life. But pure arrogance breeds profound carelessness. While the wealthy widow celebrated her bloody inheritance, the detectives in the Austin Police Department were staring at a silent, heartbroken woman in a jail cell, knowing exactly who held the leash, and waiting patiently for the moment the tether would snap. The Austin Police Department possessed the murder weapon and the person who pulled the trigger, yet the case was entirely paralyzed. A spent 20-gauge shell casing and a suspect in custody usually signaled the rapid conclusion of a homicide investigation. Here, it was merely the outer layer of a highly fortified puzzle. Inside her isolation cell, the former bookstore manager remained fiercely silent. She absorbed the capital murder charges with a stoic, detached resignation, refusing to offer the detectives a single syllable of explanation. Faced with a brick wall, the investigative team was forced to clear the board and work backward. They spent the first few months chasing shadows through the victim's past. Detectives audited the sprawling broadcasting empire, searching for ruthless corporate rivals or disgruntled executives who might have benefited from a sudden change in leadership. They probed the victim's adult children, mapping out the bitter financial friction that had erupted when their father abruptly altered his will to favor his new bride. They combed through years of employee records, looking for terminated contractors or bitter groundskeepers. Every avenue of inquiry terminated in a dead end. The slain executive was almost universally revered. The only toxic element in his entire ecosystem was the woman who now controlled his fortune. Outside the precinct, the atmosphere in the affluent Tarrytown enclave had turned highly paranoid. The community was an insulated bubble, a neighborhood where doors were rarely locked, and private security patrols kept the outside world at a comfortable distance. The brutal, intimate nature of the shooting shattered that illusion. Neighbors installed heavy deadbolts and upgraded their perimeter alarms, deeply unsettled by the idea that a random drifter could bypass multi-million-dollar defenses. But as weeks turned into months and the widow's grotesque spending sprees became public spectacle, the fear morphed into cold, cynical suspicion. The whispers across the mahogany bars of the country club were unanimous. The timeline did not make sense. The complete lack of forced entry did not make sense. The widow's sudden, aggressive liquidation of assets was the behavior of a woman cashing out, not one paralyzed by grief. The true pivot of the investigation occurred when a seasoned detective submitted a routine subpoena for the estate's telecommunication records. The massive stacks of printed logs revealed a glaring, indisputable anomaly. In the months leading up to the ambush, there were hundreds of calls logged between the heavily guarded mansion and the shooter's modest residence. The frequency was staggering, sometimes a dozen calls a day, often stretching late into the night. When investigators cross-referenced the names against local medical databases, the final, crucial piece of the architecture clicked into place. The dates aligned perfectly with an inpatient stint at a high-end psychiatric facility. The profile of a random deranged home invader completely evaporated. The police were looking at a highly coordinated, meticulously groomed assassination, but digital footprints and phone logs were only circumstantial evidence. To secure a capital murder indictment against a woman with limitless financial resources, the prosecutors needed the weapon to speak. They needed the shooter to break. Inside the Travis County Correctional Facility, the psychological conditioning that had triggered a murder was slowly rotting away. The shooter sat in a cramped, humid cell, waiting for the promised salvation. She had expected a high-powered defense attorney to walk through the steel doors, funded by the woman she loved. She had anticipated covert messages of solidarity, some sign that her ultimate sacrifice was recognized. Instead, she received absolute silence. As the seasons changed, the harsh reality of her abandonment began to penetrate her cognitive dissonance. Through the prison grapevine and fragmented local news broadcasts, the isolated inmate absorbed a devastating series of facts. Her soulmate was not organizing a legal defense fund. The widow was hosting massive catered events at the estate, purchasing luxury cars, and had already moved a new, younger boyfriend into the master suite. The realization was a slow, agonizing fracture of the mind. The narrative of the desperately abused wife vanished entirely. The shooter finally understood she had been nothing more than a biological drone, aimed, fired, and discarded into the concrete bowels of the justice system. The silence broke completely. The suspect summoned the lead detectives back to the interrogation room and systematically dismantled the entire conspiracy. She detailed the months of intense grooming inside the psychiatric ward. She laid out the manufactured crises, the relentless gaslighting, and the exact floor plan provided by the mastermind. She explained the precise logistics of the ambush, how the alarms were deactivated from the inside, how the guard dogs were locked in a distant wing, and how the heavy oak doors were intentionally left unlatched. It was a comprehensive, devastating roadmap of manipulation. However, the district attorney recognized a glaring vulnerability. A high-priced defense team would undoubtedly tear the confession apart, dismissing it as the desperate, retaliatory lies of an admitted murderer with a documented history of severe mental instability. They needed independent, irrefutable corroboration. They needed the widow to implicate herself. The final fatal error was born of pure hubris. The newly minted millionaire grew paranoid about the loose end sitting in the county jail. She understood that if the shooter cracked, her entire empire would collapse. Rather than fleeing the jurisdiction, she defaulted to the only strategy she knew, outsourcing the violence. She approached an acquaintance, casually inquiring about the logistics of hiring a contract killer to eliminate the incarcerated witness before a trial could begin. Terrified by the cold, sociopathic nature of the request, the friend immediately contacted law enforcement. Detectives wired the informant with a covert listening device and set a trap. During a seemingly innocuous lunch at a crowded Austin restaurant, surrounded by the clatter of silverware and the low hum of afternoon commerce, the recording device captured the ultimate unmasking. The widow negotiated the price of a secondary assassination with the casual annoyance of a woman haggling over a landscaping bill. She complained about the inconvenience of having to arrange a murder inside a correctional facility, entirely unaware that the audio feed was transmitting directly to an unmarked police van parked less than a block away. The net slammed shut. The authorities possessed the shooter, the motive, the communication logs, and an audio recording of the mastermind attempting to order a second execution. The velvet rope had finally snapped. The 2003 trial of Celeste Beard Johnson stripped away her carefully curated veneer of high society. Inside the fluorescent-lit courtroom, the defense attempted to paint the widow as a grieving victim, stalked and harassed by a deranged former patient. The prosecution systematically demolished this illusion. Their cornerstone was the woman who actually pulled the trigger. When the shooter took the stand, the physical contrast between the two former lovers was staggering. Tracy appeared completely hollowed out, a broken pawn forced to publicly dissect the psychological manipulation that had hijacked her sanity. She detailed the emotional extortion, the manufactured terror, and the precise blueprints she was handed to navigate the estate's defenses on the night of the ambush. Any lingering doubt among the jury evaporated the moment the prosecution played the covert audio tapes. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as the wealthy widow's voice echoed from the speakers, casually negotiating the price of a second assassination. Hearing a woman haggle over the cost of a human life with the exact same inflection used to order a country club martini eradicated any remaining sympathy. Deliberation was remarkably swift. The jury returned a guilty verdict for capital murder. The mastermind, who had spent her adult life aggressively chasing an illusion of untouchable affluence, was stripped of her multi-million-dollar inheritance and sentenced to life in prison. In exchange for her cooperation, the shooter received a 40-year sentence, finally severed from the psychological tether, but permanently bound by the catastrophic consequences of a weaponized romance. The Austin Country Club still hums with the hushed transactions of old money, entirely indifferent to the blood spilled in its name. Celeste Beard Johnson sought a shortcut to that exclusive reality, bypassing the slow accumulation of wealth by weaponizing profound human fragility. She did not merely orchestrate an execution. She mined a psychiatric ward for a loaded weapon, using a desperate search for love as the trigger. Ultimately, her limitless ambition bought her nothing but a concrete cell. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.